What's up, church family? Welcome back to the Revivalists for Christ channel. I'm your host, Jordan, and we are joined with another great guest today. We have Tim from A Frisch Perspective. Tim, thank you so much for coming on the channel today.
Thanks for having me on. Great to be here.
Yeah, so if you guys can go ahead and let us know that you can see and hear us all right. We're representing the glasses today, so put the face emoji with the glasses if you can see and hear us. It's definitely a different time slot than we're used to. We normally do evening streams over here, Tim, because everyone knows Jordan's not a morning person, but mornings are kind of going to be our new time slot for a while because of work. So I'm glad you were able to get up with us in the morning and maybe have a cup of coffee with us.
Yeah, morning is good for me. My brain is more fresh in the morning personally, so it works
Right.
for me.
See, me probably just the opposite. So I'm glad that you're coming on and carrying this because I'm just like, and I have to
Yeah.
apologize in advance. I was walking around my kitchen this morning saying your last name over and over again because for some reason my mouth cannot produce that word. So if I mess it up at any point, yeah.
It's
Just
okay.
know I
It's
know
okay.
about here
Maybe
what it is.
maybe in your head take out the C, so it just looks
I
like
literally,
Frisch,
yeah, I was like Frisch, Frisch, and for some reason it's not even the end; it's the beginning, and it's like
That's
FR. I'm like, I don't even know.
that's okay. You just call me Tim. Just call me Tim.
There you go. Well, Tim, I always like to ask my guests, what is your favorite Bible verse, and why does that one mean so much to you?
The one that comes to my mind, this was from a childhood, is Ephesians 4:32. We used to sing a song in Sunday school based on Ephesians 4:32. Maybe some people in the audience know the song. Be kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ's sake hath forgiven you. Ephesians 4:32. And we would add a but-a-dump Ephesians 4:32 in the song. So I always like that, but it means a lot, you know? We should be kind and we should be tenderhearted. We should be forgiving. Boy, we need that today in our culture greatly. But as Christians, especially, we're reminded in that verse the way God has forgiven us in Christ. So what a motive, what an example for us as to why we should forgive and how we should forgive.
Absolutely, 100%. And for those who may not be familiar with who you are, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and kind of your background?
My background actually was fundamental Baptist. My dad planted a church in Trenton, New Jersey in 1975. And it was a fundamental Baptist church. It's still there today. It's no longer really a fundamental Baptist church. It is still what I would call a Bible believing Baptist church. And my brother is now the pastor. So that church is still there in Hamilton, near Trenton, New Jersey. So I grew up in a church planting family, but um, I had two older brothers, and then I went to college in Boston. So I grew up in New Jersey, went to college in Boston, and I met my wife at Boston Baptist College. And then after college, we moved up to where my wife is from, New Hampshire. And so since college, since Bible college, I've been up in New Hampshire for the last 21 years. And now my wife, Julie, and I have 6 children. And our 2 oldest now are actually in college, and our oldest is married. So that's basically my background, is fundamental Baptist, and I still attend a Baptist church today. So that's really kind of my spiritual background.
Nice, nice. And so your YouTube channel, which for those who aren't familiar with that, you do a lot of Bible reviews and things like that. So what exactly led into your calling? What exactly do you do on your channel? And where can people find you?
Yeah, well, I wasn't really intending to be a YouTuber years ago. I mean, I didn't even know what YouTube was. Obviously, I was around when YouTube started and saw people getting on YouTube, but more recently, in recent years, I decided to make a channel, and it's called A Frisch Perspective, which is a play on the term a fresh perspective, because Frisch is actually a German name and it means fresh. So there's a double meaning there, but it's my perspective on things. And I give analysis on my channel of different topics. I do reviews, especially Bible reviews. And I talk a lot about Bible translation on my channel as well. And then I like to have fun. So analysis, reviews, and fun. And I always say it's from a Christian nerd's point of view. I consider myself a Christian nerd. I like nerdy stuff. I get into a lot of nerdy topics. But, it wasn't really intentional that I would be like a YouTuber. But I did work on staff at a church for 18 years and did ministry for a long time. And then the Lord led me to this as one of the things that I do for ministry, as well as I do help with different churches. I do pulpit supply, music, and try to help the church to be an outreach.
That's awesome. Yeah, I hear you all about the nerdy thing. I can nerd out to the point where people start to glaze over. I'm sure
Yeah.
you've seen that before, where it's just like,
Oh yeah.
that look, that nodding head. Like,
Why do you care that much about this? Yeah.
oh, I love it. Well, the one thing that I definitely want to talk about, because I was reading and I think it's a wonderful resource to have, is before we hop into the main topic of the video, you're actually the author of the book God Matters: The Importance of Belief in a World of Doubt, which I also link that and uh your YouTube channel along with your socials in the description. So if you guys want to check that out. But for those who are kind of tuning into the channel for a more apologetics, or maybe they just kind of want a more firm case for God in their daily lives, what exactly is your book about? Why did you write it? Just give us a little synopsis, if you will.
Yeah, the book is, again, it's called God Matters: The Importance of Belief in a World of Doubt. So it is an apologetic book. I actually got the title as a play on another book that at the time when I started the book was popular, called Self Matters, by a psychologist, Dr. Phil. A lot of people know who he is. He has this book called Self Matters. And I thought, you know what? What's more important than self is God. And so that became the title for the book. And the first part of the book is just talking about the existence of God and why he matters most. The second part of the book talks about all different things we experience in our lives that point back to the importance of God. And so, they're all things we can relate to, things like love, things like relationships, all different things that point us back to the importance of God himself, the creator of all those things. And then what I'm doing is I'm weaving in the gospel to that, talking about a lot from the book of Romans and sharing the gospel in that middle section of the book. And then the final part of the book gets to the two most important commands that the scripture gives, which is to love God with heart, soul, and mind, and to love others as we love ourselves. So that's basically what the book is about. It's an apologetic, but also sharing the gospel and encouraging Christians to live out those two great commandments.
That's awesome. Yeah, I would strongly recommend you guys purchase the book. I have it. I've been reading it this week and I really enjoy it because I do work in apologetics. So I definitely think it's one of those great resources to have, because not only does it tackle essentially a case for God, but it also speaks to the love present in the branch of Christianity, which is often the piece that people are overlooking because the world portrays such a distant and angry God sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, like you said, you do a lot of Bible reviews on your channel. And so, I guess one thing that I'm curious about is what exactly was it that interested you in this conversation? In, oh, what are the stories behind all these different translations? How do they compare to each other? And basically, all the things that people oftentimes would overlook. It seems almost as most don't even really pay attention to versions, or they take it to a hyper uh extreme. So there's like no in between.
Yes. Yes. And hopefully in our conversation today, we can help to have balance in this discussion. But yeah, I came from a King James only background, essentially. I mean, like I said, it was a fundamental Baptist background. So it was King James only. I was around a lot of people who said, the only true accurate word of God is the King James version and everything else is not to be trusted. So that was the backdrop. But as I got out of college, I went to a church and they used the New King James version. And one of the things that I learned early on, looking at the preface to the New King James, is actually that when you would hear people say, well, 1 John 5, 7, and 8, the King James is the only version that has all of the words in there that traditionally people are used to hearing. Actually, the New King James has that in the text as well. So the New King James is really essentially based on the Textus Receptus, like the King James Version. So that kind of opened my eyes a little bit. But as time went on, I'm so curious about the subject. I've studied it, and I did a Sunday school class at my church about it because I know people have questions, and I wanted to learn more about it for myself, but also to share that information with others. I'm a teacher by nature, and the way that God has designed me, I like to teach. And so I like to get information for myself and then share that with others. So based on my studies for Sunday school in church, and then started doing videos on this, I've learned along the way and tried to share that with others. So that's what got me into it.
Wow. Yeah, it's very interesting. And the one thing that I remember asking as a brand new Christian, and I kind of was introduced the idea that there are so many translations, and I didn't really understand the controversy behind it until much later. But for those who are seeing all these translations, or those who are introduced to something as the King James only movement, why exactly, to your knowledge and experience, do we have so many Bible translations?
Yeah, well, with a lot of questions, there are multiple answers to this question. And I know that, we can have a cynical side as to our feelings about Bible translations and why there are so many, but there can be positive reasons too. And so I was actually thinking about how it may surprise people, but there are multiple translations of a book like Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. And the reason that you have more than one translation would be one reason because some of the translations are old. And, even with a book like that, people need a translation that's up to date and understandable for our English that we use today. But another reason I think would be just there are people who think I could do a better job translating that book. I could bring out certain things that the author is saying that we need to convey in a clearer way in English than other translations have conveyed it. So even with a classic work from Victor Hugo, you can have multiple translations. And so that applies to the Bible. There are old translations. And so some of it is we need translations that are more up to date and speak the more current English. But also, I think there's a desire to try to get the original language to convey it as clearly as we can in our language. And that's a lot more difficult to do than a lot of people realize. But if you've ever actually tried to speak another language or have someone translate for you, you understand sometimes the difficulty of conveying really clearly from one language to another. So those are just some of the reasons that we have various Bible translations today.
Nice. Yeah. And I know we were talking prior to going live about how sometimes people pick up something like the King James version of the Bible and they get so intimidated because they don't understand so many of the words. It's written in a very older language, and then it just turns them off from reading entirely, which is very sad.
Mhm.
And obviously we want people in the Bible. I personally, when I was first saved at the age of 16, I started reading from the New International Version, which isn't a version I would use today, and it's also not a version that I'm really in favor of, to be honest. But
Mhm.
I also, if I were to open the King James version at that time, I wouldn't have understood it at all.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
um So I kind of in my head created like three categories where you have your word for word translations, and then you kind of have your thought for thought translations, and then you have your translations that I personally feel should be avoided altogether. So from the versions that you've seen, what are maybe a couple that you would put in each category in your own opinion?
So, yeah, there are translations that would be considered more on the word for word side, like the King James version would be considered more word for word. The New King James version, the English Standard Version, and the New American Standard Bible. Those are considered probably the most word for word. And then on the other side, you would have more dynamic translation. I think the New Living Translation would be a real clear example of a dynamic translation that is more thought for thought. But there are plenty of mediating translations that are more in between the two extremes. And I think that the New International Version is a really good example of a mediating translation. Also, the Christian Standard Bible is basically a mediating translation. It's kind of in between, and there are others too. But I don't want to overwhelm the audience, just throwing a bunch of translation names out there. But that's kind of the general spectrum. There's a man on YouTube called R. Grant Jones. R. Grant Jones has a YouTube channel, and he has a chart that kind of lists the different translations along a spectrum. And I think he does a good job. He explains why he puts them where he does along the spectrum. And I think he does a good job assessing the different translations.
And actually, I'm going to pull that chart up because I do agree. I think that is a very good chart. So I'll create that visual. But while I'm pulling
Mm.
that up, Tim, I'm curious. So, why is it that some translations don't take a more word for word approach?
Yes, that's a really good question. And there's really, I think, a misunderstanding that people have when it comes to language. And I hope that as we have this conversation, it'll get us thinking a little bit about the fact that when you think of one language to another, our tendency is to think what we would like to have is a Bible version that just takes the words of Hebrew and Greek and just transfers them directly over into English. The problem, though, is that language from different languages has different structures, and also the words don't line up perfectly. Words have ranges of meaning. And so one word in one language may not line up with a word in another language. And so really all translations can't, none of them, I should say, no translation can be perfectly word for word. So I'll give a good example. I think if you quiz people and you say, what does the Greek word logos mean? Some people pronounce it logos, but logos, what does it mean? The basic translation is word. It means word. In the beginning was the logos, the word. The word was with God, the word was God. So that's kind of like the literal translation for logos. But actually, I want to read some examples of how logos is used in Acts 1:1. In the KJV, it says, the former treatise I have made, O Theophilus, Acts 1:1. But the word for treatise is logos. So we're not translating that consistently in a literal way. We're not saying the former word that I have made, O Theophilus. We change that to treatise because that's a better explanation in English. In Romans 14:12, it says, every one of us shall give a what to himself to God. Well, we put account of himself to God in the King James, but the word there is logos. So every one of us will give a word of himself to God. Well, that's not how we translate it. We will give an account of ourselves to God, but the Greek word there is logos. And it might surprise people that the King James translates the word logos 24 different ways. So, it shows you the reason that some translators pull away from a word for word approach is because words don't match up perfectly. And then the other thing too, to just throw in here, is when you put words together, you don't always say it the same way from one language to another. And so, here are some examples of in the Greek, the word poeo means to make, generally speaking. But here are some ways that it's used. It says in Matthew 3:8, make fruit. Matthew 5:32, make adultery. I don't think most of us say that person made adultery. We say, that they committed adultery. And that's how the King James or the ESV would translate it. Or make righteousness is the Greek term. That's just not how you say it in English. So the reason that translations pull away from the word for word is because they want to make sure that they are conveying things in the way that we speak, in the way that we write in English, and do that as clearly as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, and we're going to dissect some of further uh, problems, issues that people have with kind of the more paraphrase or thought for thought
Mm-hmm.
translations. But I did want to show this chart. I believe this is the one you were talking about, Tim.
Yes, that's really
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, so this right here kind of gives you a spectrum of accurate translations. Actually, let me get my logo out of the
Yeah,
way
and
here.
actually, this one here, it says, now that I'm looking at it, departure from the Masoretic text. So he does all different comparisons.
Hmm.
This one is more focused on the Old Testament, but
Oh, okay.
he does have one. I think if you keep looking, you'll see he has one that just talks about literal versus dynamic. I'm not sure the titles he uses, but word for word versus thought for thought might be uh, what the continuum says. But
Yeah, is that the one that's like more color coded?
yeah, he has a lot of translations on there now.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So I'll take a gander at that one, but it's kind of interesting because normally I would put something like the NIV and NLT in the same category, but you kind of have like this category in between the two that I mentally created, where you said it kind of acts like a bridge between the word for word and the thought for thought type translation, and so I'm curious what you would have to say, because it's always been my concern to veer more towards the thought for thought translations. And I know that's a concern for a lot of people. So I try to
hmm.
stay as close to the word for word as I can possibly get. Is this, in your opinion, a valid concern to have?
Yes, yes, because if you go away from the more literal word for word approach, you're obviously getting more into allowing the translator to interpret what those words are saying. So expressions, for example, there's a Old Testament line, I think it's in Amos, that talks about cleanness of teeth. God gave them cleanness of teeth. That's literal. The less literal version would be God didn't give them anything to eat. And that's why their teeth were clean, because they didn't have anything in their teeth, nothing to eat. Um, so, what I say though is the literal will help you to understand how the original writers said it, and make sure that we're accountable for our translation choices. So that's why I encourage people, use a literal translation. On the other hand, cleanness of teeth is not very clear, and that's just one example. There are other things where you think you understand what it's saying, but because it's literal, you're actually misunderstanding it. And so that's where something that's more mediating, that isn't rigidly literal, can be a great corrective on that. And a good example just in real life is if you ask someone to interpret for you in another language. You're teaching or you're visiting another country and you're talking. If someone said, I'm going to interpret you 100% literally, on one hand, you'd be happy they want to be accurate, and you don't want them to just go off and say whatever they want to say. You want them to be accurate. On the other hand, if they're 100% literal, there could be some major misunderstandings. So I think we know in real life there does need to be a balance. So I encourage people, have a literal translation. It keeps that accountability there. That's where even a translation like the King James can be really good. But then consider having one as a companion translation that can kind of help you understand a little bit more what some of the literal terminology actually is getting at. So when Jesus says you can't add a cubit to your stature, okay, literally he's saying there you can't add any height, but figuratively what that expression meant was you can't add to your lifespan. And so other translations bring that out really well. So I would say, yeah, there is a place for literal, and that's an important place. But we know in real life, language can't completely be conveyed in a literal way from one language to another.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I personally use a lot of side by side comparisons myself because I'm just genuinely interested in different ways. And I do find my capability to understand a certain text is oftentimes brought out in one translation over another. But the main reason I did want to have this conversation is to really help the beginner or somebody who is shopping for a Bible and really wants to know, like, what is a good Bible for me to start with. But I do believe that there are horrible, blasphemous translations. We have like those from the cults, like the
Mhm.
Joseph Smith translation for Mormons. You have the Watchtowers translation, all those. And then I do
Mhm.
feel that there are some translations that are kind of written with a theological bias, such as
Mm.
the English Standard Version, I do believe was written with a more Reformed Calvinistic bias. Me, myself, I'm not personally a Calvinist. I'm not sure if you are, because I know that you have some content about John MacArthur on your channel, but I
Mhm.
still think this is a conversation that we can have despite those types of differences. But I'm curious, um, for those who are shopping, what
Mm.
can they do to avoid purchasing or falling in the hands of a very, very bad translation? And what are some of the biases that might be present in other translations?
Well, yeah, basically, belonging to a good church, a good Bible teaching church helps a lot because you're going to get guidance from your pastor. And probably if you're at a good Bible teaching church, they're going to be using a solid translation, and that would be a good translation to look for. But as you do your research, I think you'll learn that the prefaces to the translations will tell you a lot. You can read the preface to the New King James Version and see what their approach was, and I think that will tell you a lot. But if you're a beginner, certainly you want to go to a trusted resource, a good pastor. Um, I certainly would say the mainstream translations that are out there in the United States are trustworthy. And I know people are going to have strong feelings about the NIV, and I've actually addressed that on my channel. Nevertheless, the NIV is just one of various translations that are very popular right now. The NIV, the King James Version, you'll still see that in stores a lot, the English Standard Version. So believe it or not, the ones that you see at Walmart, in general, at least, the King James, the NIV, the New King James, I would say the English Standard Version and the New American Standard Bible, you're going to see those around a lot. And one of the reasons they're popular is because people trust them. And so, those are ones I would recommend. But, you know, like I said, trying to keep it simple, ask a pastor who's a good teacher who you can trust, and they'll give you guidance if you're a beginner to this whole subject.
Absolutely. Now, the one thing that I feel leads into some translations, not all, but I definitely think there is a motive in some, is a monetary incentive where people are able to profit off of translations due to copyright issues, which I personally do not really agree with those who copyright the word of God and make it impossible to use their translation in videos. So, is the
Hmm.
monetary element of some translations something that those who are purchasing a Bible should be concerned about?
Um, it could be, like with everything, there's usually two sides to it. One thing I will say though is most translations, even that have copyrights, will give you permission to use a decent amount. Like you could actually use the English Standard Version in a video. You may not be able to, have the whole entire book posted, but you could quote it as long as you reference that it's the English Standard Version, and you wouldn't have to worry about breaking copyright. Just look at the permissions at the beginning of the Bible translation. I do think though that, when it comes to copyright making money, there are two sides to it. And, even with the King James Version, it does have a copyright in England for English people, the people that are actually under the crown. And one reason you have copyright is to protect the text so that you can't just make changes to it and call it that version. There needs to be permission there if you were going to make any changes. So it does protect the text. And then the other thing, as far as making money, I mean, making money can have a greedy aspect, but on the other hand, making money can be very helpful to producing more copies of God's word. So it's not always a bad motivation. I would say too, just to throw this idea out there, one way you could make money is by taking a non-copyrighted text. Like in America, if you did take the King James Version, you don't have to pay anybody to produce that text, and so you would be able to make more money off the King James Version if you just were starting from scratch and wanted to make your own edition, because you don't have to worry about paying copyright royalties. So there are different ways to look at this, but I do think we have even some translations like the Berean Standard Bible now that give very generous copyright permissions. So we have a lot of options out there. But I think copyright can be a good thing. It protects the text and also allows publishers to make money so that they can produce more copies of God's word. So making money isn't necessarily a bad thing, and that's something I would add into that discussion.
That I'm so glad that you brought that Frisch perspective because that is something that I didn't even consider, and I think in my attempt to make sure that I'm not allowing any type of poor motive into my spiritual walk, I kind of overlooked just how well the copyright can actually keep out deception. So I'm really glad that you brought that perspective
Mm,
because that is something that wasn't even in my mind or in my field of consideration.
mm.
So, wow.
Glad it was
Now,
helpful.
yeah, absolutely. I'm like still processing that. I was like, wow, yeah, that's a really good point. Now, one thing that I absolutely love, and I feel like I have so many different, like people look at all the Bibles I have and they're like, why do you have so many? I'm like, because they're all study Bibles. And I just
It's
love, like, on my, to purchase list here in the near future, I want to get an archaeological study Bible, and I also want to get the apologetic study Bible. So I'm curious, as a Bible reviewer, what are your thoughts on study Bibles, and what is their place when it comes to biblical studies?
Study Bibles are great because they encapsulate a lot of information in a succinct manner. So instead of having to study, or pick up large volumes to learn about a particular subject, it kind of condenses it so that it's easier to manage. It's more manageable when you're studying, and it puts it all in one convenient space within the text or within the volume of the Bible itself. So that's really helpful. The downside of study Bibles is that they do come from different theological backgrounds. You do have to be careful because some study Bibles, you may be surprised at some of the theology that's in there if you're not aware of it. So, you just, like with everything, do your research, kind of know who the authors or the contributors to the study Bible are before you purchase it. And even if you're like, okay, I know I'm not going to agree with everything they say, as long as you know where they're coming from, that can be very helpful. But once you kind of do your homework and yeah, this is a good evangelical, people who wrote the notes to this believe the Bible is the Word of God, and they're giving me some really helpful information from this point of view, I think study Bibles can be really, really helpful for a lot of people. So I do recommend them. I just try to tell people, just have discernment when you're looking for a study Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing, encapsulating everything that we've talked about prior to this, what is the one thing, or maybe several things, that you think somebody absolutely should consider when it comes to that decision of what Bible to purchase for themselves?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people, as consumers, we just want the thing that looks nice and that when we read it, it sounds nice. But I think what they'll hear me saying as a nerd, as a Christian nerd, is you want to look for more than just the surface things. And I do think you want to look for, a translation that is trustworthy and is going to be faithful to what the original writers are saying. What I do recommend for people, though, and you've heard me say it, is maybe consider getting two Bibles rather than just one. One Bible might be something that you would say, I feel like this is easier to understand. And that's where, I'll say the Christian Standard Bible might be that for some people. Because I think that's an example of something that isn't rigidly literal, but if you're having a hard time understanding the Bible, that's a lot more accessible in its English and in the way it conveys things. And actually, it helps me, even as someone who studies the Bible a lot. I think the Christian Standard Bible is a really good example of something very understandable. But then on the other end, it's good to have something that is literal and more focused on being word for word in the form of the language as much as it can be. So maybe something like the English Standard Version or the New American Standard Bible or the King James or the New King James. And you put two translations together, and I'm talking about someone who's new, something easier to understand can be really, really helpful, because if they try to start with something like the King James, it could be really, really difficult, unnecessarily difficult, I would say, because the Bible isn't always easy to understand, even if you're using a translation that's pretty easy to understand in and of itself. The Bible still has some things that are hard to understand. So, those are my recommendations when looking for a Bible, is just maybe to consider getting two different translations. But if you're going to start with one, I don't think it's a bad idea to start with something like the Christian Standard Bible. That would be one that, to me, a new believer, I think, could understand, and yet it's still quite accurate in its, trying to be literal.
Interesting. Yeah, I think a lot of people, unfortunately, they do buy into that veneer that you were talking about of like, oh, this cover looks pretty. I'm going to get this one for my bookshelf. And then it just sits there and collects dust. And I do think it's important to consider the contents within. So I'm very happy to hear you speak on that. Now,
Mhm.
the question that I'm wondering, what is the Frisch perspective? What is Tim Frisch's favorite version of the Bible, and why do you value that one so much?
So I have a video, and I wish I could remember the title of it. It might be like how to choose a Bible translation, and I think I come out in that video and share my choices. What I tell people, though, is I look at the literal versus the dynamic, which we've talked about, more the word for word approach versus the thought for thought. I also look at historic translations versus modern, because I actually grew up with the King James and I really value historic translation. And I also look at the Textus Receptus versus the critical text of the New Testament, which could be a whole other video, and isn't actually my area of expertise per se. But I will say I think that's, another issue people will talk about. So when I put it all together, my two favorite, I can't just give one. My two favorite for me personally would be like the New King James Version, because it has all of the heritage of the King James and a lot of the phrasing of the King James, but you also have great footnotes. And then the other one is the Holman Christian Standard Bible or the Christian Standard Bible. Both of those have very good footnotes, but they're a great complement to the King James or the New King James. So you've got historic, modern, you have something that's more literal and something that's a little bit less literal. And then you also have something that's Textus Receptus representative, and then something that would be critical text representative in both of those translations. My two favorite, the New King James and the Christian Standard Bible.
Nice. And the Christian Standard Bible is the one that you would recommend for beginners, is what you said, right?
Yeah, if they might have a hard time understanding older English. Now, you mentioned to me before that you like the New American Standard, and actually most people say that that's pretty easy for them to understand. So, a new believer might check out the New American Standard Bible and see if that's understandable for them. But it is a literal translation, and so I still think as you study the Bible more, it's good to take the New American Standard Bible and compare it with something like the Christian Standard or even the NIV. But the NIV has a lot of baggage for a lot of people. And you may have even referenced it earlier that that's really not your preference.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand. The NIV came on the scene in the late 1970s, and it was the first translation that really made a run at displacing the King James Version. And so I think because of that, a lot of people have a lot of hard feelings toward the NIV, and I understand that. And then the NIV 2011 had a lot of controversy as well, and I understand that as well. So I'm not saying you have to read the NIV, but it is something that could still be a complement to something like the NASB.
Yeah, well, and for me, um, I personally like to read the NASB along with the KJV for the similar
Mm-hmm.
reasons that you were saying. And our mutual friend Joshua Barzon, he actually brought up a company that I'm hoping to partner with. I've been in talks with them, but they're doing custom made parallel Bibles, which I just think is awesome. And I think a good
Mm,
parallel Bible is a
mm,
way to maybe approach this idea of multiple Bibles from a
yes.
more cost effective way if you're on a
Yes.
budget. And it
Yes.
gives you the chance to like you have several translations side by side, and some of them I think most of them would also have the footnotes that come with those translations as well.
Yes, I wouldn't be surprised, but that's an excellent point. A parallel Bible with two translations, you could just look at them both together at once on one page.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the one thing, and by the way, guys, if you want to go ahead and put any questions that you have for Tim in the chat, I will start collecting those and ask them towards the end of the broadcast. But one thing that I think we all hear is those who will just say, I can't understand the Bible. And it really doesn't even matter what version it is. They have very little understanding of the easier versions. So they just say, I can't understand the Bible, so I'm not going to read it. So what would you say to those people that may stumble upon this video? And what are some
Mm.
possible tips that you have for them as well?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would encourage people to give themselves time. The things that you know really well in your life, if there's a sport that you thoroughly have knowledge of, or if there's a hobby that you're really into and you've kind of have an expertise in that area, it's because you spent a lot of time doing it. So give yourself time. We can't expect to understand the Bible in 5 minutes or even a week or a year necessarily. And after you study the Bible for a year, if you're reading it consistently every day, you're going to understand it better. But if you read it continuously for, year after year after year, you're going to come to deeper and deeper levels of understanding. And so I'm still learning as I study the Bible today, years and years later. So just give yourself time is one encouragement. It's not an overnight thing. It's going to take time. And all of a sudden, you'll start to understand more and more as you consistently read, like with anything. Also just try to be strategic about it. Maybe start with Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John if you're just getting into the Bible, the beginning of the New Testament, learn about Jesus. And those are story-oriented books of the Bible. They focus on accounts of Jesus' life. But the other thing you can do is, just make sure you're part of a good Bible-believing church where you're learning things by listening to your pastor, listening to good teaching, and it's giving you more and more background knowledge. And one other thing you can do, aside from all of those things, is, you could get a study Bible. And some of the main study Bibles, the New King James from Nelson, the King James, even the English Standard Version has a study Bible. There are different study Bibles for the major translations. I'm sure the NASB has one too. And those could be helpful to you in giving you a little bit of background knowledge as you're reading the Bible. Just remember the notes aren't inspired.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, are there any study Bibles that you personally enjoy that you would recommend to people?
Well, the audience always matters. And so, you hinted at it earlier based on kind of my preferences and background. I would actually often in my circles recommend the ESV study Bible.
Mm-hmm.
But if that's not fitting for the people of this audience, I know that the New King James study Bible is probably really solid. The Christian Standard Bible that I mentioned earlier has a really good study Bible, and I would think those would fit this audience quite well.
Absolutely.
Or the King James study Bible too. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one thing that I keep hearing you say, and I do think it's an important conversation to have because obviously there's all sorts of wackadoodle theologies out there. You keep using the word Bible believing church, and I think, especially from you coming from a Baptist background, some things that are missing from non-Bible believing churches are important doctrines such as imputed righteousness, eternal security, all those sort of things. So when you're saying Bible believing church, like one part of understanding the Bible is getting in a good Bible believing church, what exactly does that term encompass for you?
It means really two things that I'm looking for. One is that they believe the Bible is the inspired word of God. You can usually find that on their website. So you're looking for their theology. Do they actually believe the Bible? And then the second thing, once you've determined, okay, this sounds like they're sound. I've looked at their statement of faith. They believe in the Bible. Then you have to look at their practice. Do they teach the Bible? Now, even if they say on their website, we believe the Bible, but you go to the church and really it's just a pep talk, but they're not teaching the Bible, I would say you need to be at a church that believes the Bible and teaches the scripture faithfully. And, these are things you learn as you go to churches and you grow in your knowledge and understanding over time, but you will come to understand there are churches that some do a better job and some do a less good job. And then there are extremes as well. There are people that totally don't even believe the Bible. And then there are other groups that are very legalistic and they're kind of misusing the Bible in ways that are not healthy and helpful. So, there's a lot to unpack there, and it's hard in a short amount of time. So if anybody ever wants to email Jordan or me with questions about where to go to church, I think it can be helpful just to talk to someone and find out, okay, where do you live? What are the options that you have? But a church that believes the Bible and teaches the Bible is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously I tend to be very outspoken on this channel about things. And so obviously when it comes to something like even Pentecostal movements and stuff like that, I'm totally against that sort of thing. So personally, I think, from your background, and not so much my background, but what I've come to learn is the best, I guess you could say, denomination, but I don't even want to call it that, would be the Baptist movement. And personally, even those who I may not agree with on every topic, I've learned great deals from. Like, personally, not being a Calvinist, I've still learned amazing things from Calvinists, especially people
Mm-hmm.
like James White. And
Mm-hmm.
so for me, I think it is safe. Of course, there are extremes in the Baptist movement too, and there's people all over with the Baptist movement. But I do think it is safe and something that I don't find in other movements quite as frequent. That biblical exegesis, that verse by verse study, and maybe in Calvary Chapel based denominations they do kind of like the verse by verse, but I definitely
Mm-hmm.
think that is a safe movement to do
Mm.
your studies under, honestly.
Yeah, I don't know where you even are located, but your location can make a difference because
Mm.
Baptist is such a broad term, and depending on where you live, you might be surprised if you walk into a Baptist church what you encounter. So that's why I emphasize the Bible part. But you're right. A lot of Baptist churches would focus on the Bible. A lot of Bible churches, that might be in their title, that it might
Mm.
say something Bible church, which are usually Baptists that just don't have Baptist in their title.
Yeah.
So, those are ones to look into.
Yeah. And also, we have a viewer in the chat who is always amazing, Chow Young Cat. He is offering for anybody who is on the stream a copy of Tim's book. If anybody is interested and wants to let Chow know, he is just requesting to know before the end of the stream. But thank you, Chow. You're always so
That's
generous in the resources you
that is
provide.
awesome. That is so great.
We
That
love
is
Chow.
great. Oh, so
Now,
generous.
right. Oh, yeah. I love the people in
Mm,
this community. It's so sweet.
that's
Now,
wonderful.
there's the opposite extreme. Well, I don't want to call it an extreme, but there's the opposite to the people who I don't want to read the Bible or I can't understand the Bible. There are those who are like, okay, I want to understand everything down to the parentheses. So, for those who want to take a more scholarly approach to their biblical studies, what is a good method slash version that they can use, and what advice would you have for those people?
Well, I have a feeling those people probably discover a lot of resources on their own because because they're bent toward that academic mindset. But I have a couple of videos on online resources as well as paper. Just different approaches to study. Some people prefer to use online materials. Some people prefer using paper books, printed books. So there are a lot of options out there. Personally, though, I do think that the online uh, resources that we have now are really, really wonderful because there's so much out there, and you can have a lot of information, a library of information, but you don't have to have a huge amount of space in your home. Also, it's just really easy to use it. You can look up Greek words very easily with some of these online tools. So blueletterbible.org, that's one I use a lot. Now, if you really want to get into some of the more technical stuff, I know Logos, or Logos is how I pronounce the Greek word, but Logos Bible Software. is another resource that people use. Strong's Concordance is a I'm sure you can find it online, but that's a volume that if you're looking up specific words in the Bible and you want to see all of the uses of that word, a concordance like Strong's is really helpful. And then, commentary sets. If you really get into it, you can find commentary sets and all kinds of Bible dictionaries and stuff. But the blueletterbible.org to me is just a really nice starting point for understanding a little bit more about the original languages. And I think that's good. Another study, a nice study resource, I think, is the NET Bible, because even if you don't like that translation, the interesting thing about the NET Bible, which you can look that up online, I think, and all the notes are there for you to read. It tells you why they made the choices they made. It gives you a window into the translation process. So that's a pretty cool resource. So there's a lot out there for us nerds, but Blue Letter Bible is a great place to start. Logos Bible Software is, really tremendous resource for people who get into technical stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think Blue Letter Bible is really a good one stop shop because you have the concordance, you have certain things that you would get at Logos. And then
Mm-hmm.
the thing with Logos is it's really good, but
Mm-hmm.
there is a free tier, but there's also like price plans, and the
You have
more
to, yeah.
resources you want, the more you pay type thing. So I think for those who may be on a budget, I do think Blue Letter Bible is an absolute amazing place to start, and maybe checking out some of those free features on Logos as well. Absolutely. So Tim, as we're wrapping up here, I was curious if there were any final thoughts that you had in regards to the conversation as a whole that you wanted to share.
Well, I just, want to encourage people not to get overwhelmed with all of the stuff that you hear out there, and also not to be reactive. I think you can hear in our conversation a lot of these topics people feel strongly about, and it can be hard to have an objective and measured kind of conversation about these things. But I really appreciate what you're doing here, Jordan, because it's encouraging us to talk about things. And I'm all for people having opinions. I
Mhm.
actually think at the end of the day, we should, and if someone, chooses a certain translation and that's something they feel strongly about, that is totally fine. But for people who are searching, it can be really confusing. So I just, want to encourage those people to, be patient, do your homework, listen to good conversations like this. Be careful about getting swept up into hysteria, because I think you cover on your channel that type of thing. You mentioned the charismatic or the Pentecostal, and people get swept up into really strong type of things, and KJV onlyism can become that way, where it becomes like this all-encompassing thing. And so we got to be careful about getting swept up into things and make sure that we are using the minds that God has given us.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you guys want to see more of those extremes that we're talking about with the KJV only movement, again, I would point you to that conversation we did with Joshua Barzan, because he actually brought a clip of Jack Kyle, and that was my first time really being introduced to him. And I was like,
Mm,
wow,
mm.
wow. But Tim, I do appreciate so much being generous with your time, coming on this small little channel and sharing your Frisch perspective. And again, for those who are just now tuning in or on the playback, where can people connect with you at?
Well, I think you mentioned that there are some links that you made available, but I am on Facebook at A Frisch Perspective. I'm also on Instagram at A Frisch Perspective. And if you need to know how to spell that, that's my last name there, A Frisch Perspective. So that's my channel. So Facebook, Instagram are the two main ones. I'm also on Twitter, although I don't use my channel name for Twitter, but I always love it when I happen to find a Christian on Twitter, because Twitter's a weird place. So if you want to look for me at Timothy Frisch on Twitter, you may find me. I have a Phillies symbol in my logo on Twitter. But those are the social media places people can find me. You can also email me at frischperspective@gmail.com.
That's awesome. So you were wondering where I was from early. I'm from Pennsylvania. So the Phillies, that's like one of the first things that I noticed. I was like, oh, cool.
So you're more from the closer to Philly side, or are you more from the Pittsburgh side?
I'm more from the Pittsburgh side. So we're kind
Okay.
of like in Pittsburgh
That's
Nation
right.
right here.
So it was nice of you to allow a Philly guy to come on your channel.
Me, it all goes over my head. I mean, not that I'm against sports, but to me, I'm just like,
It's not your
I don't know.
thing.
It's like just watching one side of, I don't know. It's just not my interest. As I'm sitting here, like, geeking out over, like, the Greek and Bible translations, but it's sports that can't keep my interest.
Yeah. Well, I'm one of those people that, I really love connecting with people from all different places. And one of the things I've done on my channel is I tell my audience, if you want to send me a ball cap of your favorite team, I'll wear it on my channel. And I've collected like 23 hats out of the 30 teams that people have sent to me. And I have worn a Pittsburgh hat on my channel before. So
That's so funny. Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, people know I'm obsessed with beanies, so
that's great. We all have our obsessions.
Right. Sometimes they're unhealthy, but
Hopefully
well,
not.
guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning in for this conversation. Be sure to give it a like. Be sure to check out Tim. Again, those links are in the description below. But I hope you all have an amazing day, and God bless. Thank you so much to my generous patrons who help me do this full time. If you'd like to help me do this full time, there is a PayPal donation link in the description, or consider becoming a Patreon today. For only $5 a month, you can gain access to weekly Patreon only streams and posts, all my research notes, and all your comments will be prioritized and answered first. Higher tiers receive free Revivalists for Christ merch, a shout out in all videos, early access to content, and even can decide what content I post on the channel. There is much more, so consider becoming a Patreon today by heading over to patreon.com/revivalist for Christ. If you're not sure that you're going to heaven, be sure to click the video on the left or click on the right for more great content. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel to help equip you, the 21st century Christian, in the field of apologetics and evangelism, by clicking on the